So back in the early days of GSL, it was run by this site called gomtv.net. The first 3 seasons of GSL, which we've been covering here in the Gregathon series, were open brackets. That means whoever your opponent was, you played in a best of 3, unless it was one of the very latest rounds of the tournament, and whoever won advanced and whoever lost was eliminated. Obviously, at some point, GSL Code S and GSL style groups had to be evolved and established. If you followed any other esports, and they're all way worse than StarCraft, but any of the ones that want to be serious implement GSL style groups whenever they want to see which team is best, as opposed to just like random draw or single limb seeding. But this is a bit of a sort of archaic version of GSL style groups where it's GSL style groups but it's best of 1. So this is sort of a mix of the current GSL style groups in 2021 and Legacy of the Void, and the 2022, and then the OSL groups of like the old school, like the 2005 OSL, where it was just like a Swiss and everyone would play each other. And then if there were ties, they would just do tiebreaker matches, sometimes to excess. That is to say that IdrA lost to Jinro on Jungle Basin, and it was a freaking best of 1. So he doesn't get to play like a game on Cross Positions Metalopolis. He just goes into the loser match against this talented Korean Terran named OGS Ensnare. OGS was a big team that ended up partnering with Team Liquid back in the day, and they had players like MC on the roster and Top. IdrA up there in the top right, the macro machine. So Ensnare is going to call for a pause, so it's just nice to see that it's these VODs up on the internet, because what happened is GomTV came in and they paywalled after the first 3 open seasons. It became Code S in January 2011, which is what we're watching, the season directly after the one IdrA lost to MVP, which was Open Season 3, 2010. Remember, StarCraft 2 came out in the summer, the late summer, so by the time they did 3 GSLs, it was like near the end of the year already. And whenever they did GSLs back in this day, in 2011 they literally did like 10 GSLs. It's not like now, or remember 2016 when they did a jokish 2 GSLs? 2 GSLs, that's it. That's a fucking joke. Funny, because everyone remembers Beyond's GSL from that year, and it was really great and a phenomenal one, but now pretty much there's 3 GSLs a year. But it's funny because there used to be 10. I think the happy medium is probably like 4. 3 is okay. 3 is like you really want GSL when the off season's waning on, and you really want GSL in between seasons, and you're really excited every night. So it's hard to say that 3 is too few, because I'm on the edge of my seat interested when there is 3, but in 2011, they really tested the waters of what was too much. They had a season every month, pretty much, and they had Code A too. I think the Code A thing really fucked them over, because GSL Code S was the gold standard, but then you had Code A perma broadcasting with their disgusting paywall. And it was just like oversaturation, I think, like that, because Wolf and Kaldor were doing the Code A games. Tasteless and Artosis did it for a second, but it was just way too much work. I mean, keep in mind, like a whole season of Code S in a month is crazy. But to hit my punchline here, fellas, the reason these games were sort of sought after and I'm happy to cast is because GOM, who paywalled these fucking games, and then they would retroactively upload the VODs like a year and a half later, like in December of 2012. Oh, here's the finals of January 2011, or January of, just basically the beginning of the last year, whenever you were in December, and it's like, these are ancient history. Like, a lot of people will only watch StarCraft 2 if it's modern, or the current patch. Obviously, the target audience for these videos are not like that. But it's just something to consider. because GOM did a shit job at uploading all the VODs, and they essentially didn't upload the VODs January 2011 to like August 2011. So I found this random on the internet that randomly started ripping them to the internet like a few months ago. Like, this guy had them on an old PC and just started going at it and ripping the VODs. So I'm gonna cast these games. God forbid his channel get taken down in some repugnant strike, or I mean, who knows? You can never be sure these days. I was watching some old VOD on HD StarCraft's channel the other day, and he had like default profile picture and his name was Alex. Like, it wasn't even HD StarCraft anymore, it was like the Gmail default Alex, and it just made me wonder, like, a lot of these channels do a terrible job of properly archiving VODs. Look at GOM. I literally wanted to watch this series for years. Like, as weird as it sounds, I went up and looked at like the battle reports on Team Liquid of this series and saw interviews of IdrA referencing his matches versus Ensnare and Czech and Genro in this group and talking about how good Genro was on Jungle Basin. Wanted to see him, could never see him. Even in 2012 when GOM's website's still up, it's like the VOD system wasn't proper, and then suddenly GOM basically sells or doesn't care about StarCraft 2 and releases them to Afrika. I don't know what actually happened, but Afrika becomes the company in charge of GSL instead of GOM, and then GOM is just like, well, fuck it, we want to upload those VODs. So if not for some random guy out in the fucking interwebs, these games never would have been accessible. And I know it sounds weird and erotic as you see a Hellion opener here for Ensnare on the very open Xel'Naga Caverns. It's like, I've been actively looking for these games for a long time, and not just like one search, but like tons of searches over years. And I'm just so happy that this guy happened to have them ripped to his computer. And remember whenever Twitch did that big DMCA avarice strike, and OGN, the company that had many leagues, mostly known for League of Legends, like it was basically like the GSL for League of Legends, but they hosted a plethora of other Star League, StarCraft stuff. They just like deleted all their VODs without warning. They were like very little to no warning, like, fuck it, like, we're not gonna go in and like private every VOD or like splice out a VOD that has sound, so we're just gonna nuke all our VODs so we don't get illegitimate strikes. Well, it's like all that esports history is gone, and that's like a big reason why I do this Venomous Classic series, is I actually care about StarCraft 2 history and the history of the GSL and specific players I really like. And I want people who are searching for these old games that care about what happened to these old players or what the meta was like to be able to find them. And we can see here IdrA favoring a Roach opener, and this is for two reasons. A lot of people went Hellions on this map, and Roaches were sort of seen as the counter to Hellions. As you see Hellions die there, and the Queen was so bad. Notice IdrA left a couple Roaches behind there to defend, that was smart. But oftentimes this map was so open where if Terran fast expanded, like some cutesy corn dog Roach pressure could catch him off guard. They might just have like a one bunker down there. Because the choke is so wide on this map for Terran and Toss, it's like, are you really going to sit there and make like a 6 gateway wall? Most Terrans just made one bunker and was like, I hope he doesn't come from the other two angles. I was watching an old Marine King VOD on this map the other day, like in this era. And Tasis and Artosis go like, oh, there's a lot of room to move around, there's a lot of corridors. Isn't it bizarre to think that this map, which like now would seem so claustrophobic and like you were on top of each other, and that like the two towers control the whole map, it was seen at that time as a map where someone could like use different alleyways and angles and be all over the map. It just goes to show, whenever you have maps like Steppes of War and Jungle Basin in the pool, it really sets the standard for what you have to deal with. No tumor out here, no Ling speed or Roach speed for IdrA. This is going to be so hard to hold, as Ensnare is going for a Blue Flame Hellion push. Blue Flame very popular on this map because it's so laughably open. And IdrA here is going to try to juggle and not lose any drones. He loses a couple there, he pulls a few away just in case, and thankfully he does. Because the last thing you want to do is let Blue Flame Hellion take pot shots at your drones. Remember, Blue Flame did extra damage to light units at this time. It was either like +5 or +10 more than it is now. Blue Flame was way better at this time. And Terrans would sometimes just get Blue Flame, make a handful of Hellions, and incorporate them off into their push off of one factory at this time. Nice of IdrA to leave one little roach behind so he doesn't just get freaking blindsided by a Hellion run by. Now we think of the quintessential, oh, he's always just going to make Hellions, like the innovation build, like reactored Hellion to be safe. Wasn't like that at this time. There were a lot more Terran openers that really caused Zerg stress, like the Nitro Pack Reaper upgrade, an opener, obviously, like the 5 racks Nitro Pack bullshit. And then even though that got patched out, there was still the 3 racks, a different myriad of timing pushes. And then the way the Hellion was used, people would go one factory, tech labbed Blue Flame Hellion like that, and just include Blue Flame Hellions in their push if it was a good map for Blue Flame Hellions. Regularly. I've seen that multiple times in this era where people would just get Blue Flame with like a few Hellions. Now in a few months, in 2011, the middle of it, like May and July, because remember this is the most competitive computer game ever, the meta moves that fast over the course of a month, so it's not like I can say like 3 years later, because obviously that was fucking hot. So we're in January of 2011 here. 6 months later, it would get to a point where Terrans realized it would be better to make multiple factories, one of them researching Blue Flame, one of them reactored, and then getting 3 Hellions at a time. And then when Blue Flame finished, it would be like 10 Blue Flame Hellions and Marines and or a medevac, and then you could just run over Zerg. But these pushes where Terrans got Blue Flame Hellions and used them sort of as a tool throughout the game, but didn't make a ton of them, it was cute in the sense that Blue Flame Hellions were good, but you weren't actually taking advantage of the power spike properly and doing something that really terrified your opponent, because it's like 4 Blue Flame Hellions, right? Well, like 4 Blue Flame Hellions isn't all that more scary than just 4 Hellions. Whereas the Blue Flame Hellion builds that became popular and dominated Wings of Liberty from May of 2011 to March of 2012, like those Blue Flame Hellion builds were all 2 factory, and it was like, here I am with 9 Hellions, lol, you have 1 extra queen because the queen range is bad, and you just lost an insane amount of drones and would lose the game outright. If a guy has 4 Hellions, even if you are somewhat surprised, you're probably not just going to straight lose the game off of it. Because at that point you're going to have some idea what's going on, and you're going to be ready for something in general, whether it's like a drop or a bio push or their big push. It's not going to be like, oh, 4 Hellions, I'm just going to die to that. So that's why we saw the Blue Flame Hellions used in conjunction with other units in a push. In addition to that, as we see IdrA knifing in here, trying to get some damage done, I really like how in this era the attacks cascaded into one another, where if someone did a 2 racks and it failed but they retained a lot of the Marines and stopped rallying, they would sort of parlay the units that they held into the next push, and then they would kill a 3rd and retreat, and then the units they retreated with would be in the next push. A big thing in Legacy of the Void that we see is whatever little offensive is used is either dead or it's so safe that it's never going to die. For instance, like the 221 Marine drop, or 211 rather, the 2 medevac stem timing drop that we see tons of variations on that build where it's just get stem quick, get medevacs quick. With boost, you're never really going to make it's almost impossible to make like a game losing mistake against Zerg, even with the queen being better in Legacy than it is here. And that is just very boring to know that, like, alright, the Terran's gonna attack and there's really no risk. And here we see a lot of risk. The Terran sieges up all their tanks. He's got a ton of Marine Marauder, and IdrA has a lot of Roaches here. He's gonna come in with Roach Bane and then come in with Muta as well. And a lot of Roaches are left over on the ramp. And a very weird, scrappy fight as Roaches are fighting here with Mutas, going against a lot of Marauder tank. And very bizarrely, IdrA made a crapload of Roach, and I don't think the Terran player Ensnare was expecting that at all. I think he was expecting a lot of Ling Bane, and in this era, a big part of the metagame was if you had 4 or more tanks sieged up, and the player was going to roll into you with speed banes, shit, a lot of the times on these weird maps, they wouldn't have creep spread out where it needed to be, so you could just get huge tank splash hits on the banes. And it was one of these things where there wasn't a lot of follow-up. Once the banes died, it was worthless. So IdrA had so many Roaches, such a big backbone, in addition to his normally extremely high amount of mutas that a normal mutaling Bane player would have. He was able to crush that push because it was like, he has as many mutas as a muta guy should have, but also has like 20 Roaches. And it's funny because Roaches now, you see them all the time in mixed defense pushes like that. Roaches now can turn into Ravagers, which are a god tier unit with a ton of utility. You couldn't make the Ravager at this time in Wings of Liberty. You couldn't do that for a half decade, so the Ravager completely changes what it means to make a Roach. No Zerg at this time wanted to make a Roach. The Roach was a joke. Nobody liked the Roach. It was seen that if you had to make a Roach, you were like being put behind. The Roach didn't scale. It was bad against a lot of stuff. It got countered by a lot of stuff. The Marauder, the tank, just straight fucking hard counter it. It doesn't even really do well against the Marine, for Christ's sake, once it has medevac. So, for IdrA to make that many Roaches, to be safe and still have a plethora of mutas, just goes to show why they call him the macro machine. That was exceptional. IdrA taking this middle gold base. That side base is alive and kicking. Xel'Naga Caverns did have this weird dynamic that played out where players sort of decided whether they were going to take the safe third or the gold in the middle, which was virtually impossible to hold unless you were Terran and made it a PF like this. And almost all Zergs would just take the safe one, but then it was sort of like, now do you want to take the gold? But what we would see is like really safe players like IdrA would take one of those side bases, and then once they snowballed their lead even further, then it was like, okay, now I'll take the gold. Because if you took the gold too early on this map, it was so central to the map that it was nearly unholdable. So if you lost one fight, that was just going to snowball. Because there's a big difference between you lose your I don't give a shit 5th base and you lose your 3rd. If you lose a 3rd at this time in this matchup, suddenly you don't have the money or larva for proper mutaling baneling. And we can see the Thor being microed heavily, trying to get shots on the mutas. Another Thor comes out, unfortunately for Gregors. And the matchup really revolved around the Thor as far as a counter to muta, because obviously Marines are going to shred mutas if you fight straight up, but just in terms of preventing the Zerg from going mass mutalisk and being able to harass with impunity, the Thor was the real ticket. Back in the Wings of Liberty beta, and even before the Wings of Liberty beta, when people were just like playing at BlizzCon and shit and seeing these weird little preview videos, people were saying, well, with no Science Vessel Radiate, what's going to deal with mass muta? I remember seeing this old school IdrA interview from like March of 2010 with Artosis, and saying like, with unlimited unit select, if I can have 40 mutas on one control group, because remember on Brood War you had highly limited control groups, if I can get 40 mutas on one control group, then Terran needs some splash. If they don't have a radiate, like, they're gonna be fucked. Like, they gotta have something to replace a radiate, the Science Vessel ability from Brood War, and the Thor was what ended up replacing it. And it got to this point where, very early on in Wings of Liberty, the Terrans figured out, no matter what abusive, obnoxious, or aggressive build they did early, oftentimes the Zerg was going to try to go into muta to deal with it, because remember, there's a lot of like weird terrains on these early maps that's hard for Zerg, and mutas help them deal with that. Mutas also let you beat an opponent who, even with a map advantage and any other sort of meta advantage, the Muta puts you in the driver's seat to beat someone who's worse than you. That's the big thing the Muta does. And we can see IdrA here going into Broodlord. This is like the classic IdrA Fields macro game, where he goes into Muta and maintains control and tempo of the game through the mid and late game, and has a bunch of Mutas left over when he gets his Broodlords. Now what we really need are Infestors here, because in the same 2010 interview I was referencing, IdrA said Infestors were Zerg's best weapon, which hilariously a lot of Zergs wouldn't fully employ until mid-2012. This was a classic part of this map. If Zerg got up to Broodlord, they would try to sit over this middle dead zone and hit the Terran PF third at the gold. IdrA's in this position though where there are so many Thors he can't use his 25 Mutas to jump in and kill the Vikings because of the Thor splash. Look at how diligent Ensnare is being. Good micro. IdrA really needs Infestors here. What's brutal is the map is so small and short that IdrA can't just like trade out a crap load of units and then remake on the perfect army, because he'll just get pushed and lose all of his shit, his gold base for sure. It's not like he has a junky army and didn't macro properly, he only has 3 roaches, and notice he has 11 Winfestors. And of course I can't control the tabs in a VOD like this, but the tab usage was just wretched. 3 Marauders come up to snipe the space, and then a handful of Marines come up to snipe the right side. If you're going for knocking out buildings, Marauders really are the way to go, and still are. Back at this time, people didn't understand how to use Infestors and wouldn't even hotkey them properly, so just remember that. And of course, people didn't know how good they were until 2012, like a whole 16 months later, so we'll see how IdrA controls his Infestors here. And he gets his left base punched out, which is brutal, because the Terran does have that normal sort of pocket base that's guarded by rocks in addition to their middle gold. IdrA sends some Ling over. Love that. It's important when you know a base like that, which is vulnerable and gonna get attacked, you want to just fucking spam static at that, especially in a weird, goofy game like this. Like if you like to play 2v2 or BGH especially, or if you're going to play these retro maps with your friend, if one of these bases is just going to get spam attacked, don't be afraid to make a lot of spines whenever you're on a max economy like this. And IdrA's in this brutal spot where his opponent has too many Thors, he can't get within Infestor range, and he can't get his Broodlord shots, and he's starting to peter out. He's really getting worried about the Terran catching up with him macro-wise, because this isn't one of those maps where Zerg can take a 7th and 8th and 9th base, keep expanding. Nice fungal there. He's going to want to chain that and kill it with Corruptors. His Corruptors are a dogshit, terrible fucking unit and really aren't going to do anything of note. And only 2 Broods here, which is brutal. Of course, you really want 6 or more to like push the issue. And Ensnare running down, and if IdrA loses this phase, things get really bad. But again, he's got those couple spines to buy him time. The Muta force is very formidable without Thors, and he knifes in here with some Broods. And the Broods are just so good against a massive siege tank army. The siege tanks will just shoot the Broodlings and do team damage. So if IdrA can just keep sort of pushing and prodding with the Broodlords, it's going to make the defense in general worse. Xel'Naga Caverns is most famous for this jokish little back path that goes above the normal rocked third bases for the players, the non-golds that is. And it's funny because as much shenanigans that happens there, and even though IdrA was smart enough to leave a roach, that almost never gets creeped. We can see him trying to use his Mutas. Mutas are funny. You spend, as soon as the Spire finishes, from like the late game, you spend as much time as you can trying to mass Mutas and get upgrades for them and use them and harass them. get value out of them, and then at some point in the late game it's like, oh, these units that I've been massing for 10 minutes are now fucking worthless. And it's always such like a disappointing threshold, like, oh, they have 3+ Thors, all these mutas are worthless. And IdrA's at that point where he kind of wants to trade off the mutas, but he knows that if he trades them off sloppy, he'll just die. Mutaling Baneling screams forward with Muta, Ultra, and Fester. This is pretty much perfect tier 3 usage here from the Gregathon. Oh my god, that fungal growth. It gets pretty much the whole army. And is he going to chain that or hit any Banes? He chained it enough to get most of the Marines into the graveyard. Terran player at 1k, 1.5k. IdrA has already maxed back up to 200. You could see the resource tab there for a second. You're like, my god, he's already at 200? Yeah, he's really at like 110 active supply, but everything else is ultras and eggs. If you ever play this game, and I know a lot of people are sort of done with it and bored of it and just sort of like these retro games, but I like to drop these little tips in. Whenever you remax on Ultraling, you always want to have at least a couple, as Richie Aprea would say, a couple of 3 infestors, because the fungal goes so insanely well with Ultraling Bane that you're always going to want to have that, and the main way that you're going to get countered or screwed around is someone just infinitely kiting you and using the ultras melee against you, so the fungal can just completely shit on that. And let's see what IdrA does. He's sort of at the point where his macro is so much better and he has so many more ultras than his opponent just has anything. They could kite forever and they still wouldn't win. I mean, that was like a few Thors and some bio versus 10+ ultras. This is just a horrifying army. IdrA getting more ultras, getting ventral sacks. He has the left side base mining. He's getting the defensive PF and then the tanks. This is just a master class on how to play Zerg on a map that is really not all that good for Zerg. This hilariously was seen as a map that, because it was around since the betas, GG is called by Ensnare, and IdrA wins in his leather bracket. It's like, oh, this map is not so bad. That was like any time a map wasn't an atrocity for Zerg, you had Terran and Protoss players coming out of the woodwork saying, oh, actually, this is a great Zerg map, you know. Oh, it's so good for Zerg. And it's like, well, wait a second there, cowboy. As if we just snap it back for a second. It's like, oh, the natural's real open, so it's hard for Protoss and Terran to take a base. Well, it's also hard for Zerg to defend their natural, especially stuff like Hellions. We would see Blue Flame Hellion openers on this map almost exclusively from smart Terrans. Or just straight up reactored Hellion. And like I said before, there were a lot more options. You just didn't go reactored Hellion. Late 2011, yeah, reactored Hellion was the standard opener, but in this era, no way. People didn't even know how to do Blue Flame Hellion openers properly, like I was mentioning earlier, so this map, really not good for Zerg. I play this weirdo guy named Twin Gats. I have a video on my channel about him. And he always makes this game, this custom game on Battle.net, like once every few months. 1v1 Xel'Naga, let's go. And I'll always join it. And he's just like a weird, cheesy, low-level player. But sometimes I almost died to him last time I played him, just because Xel'Naga is so close. That's the thing that most people don't realize. With the Queen being as bad as it is, and the maps being as small as they are, really dangerous for Zerg. So make sure you sub for more and check out the playlist.